Hello, ECON 345 students, and welcome to another fantastic episodes of Exploring into the Taxation and Expenditures of Governments. It's a really interesting time in the neighborhood, and we are going to learn about some fascinating topics today. So we're going to learn about Social Security, income distribution, and different types of welfare programs. I don't know what's gotten into my cat, but you'll see her just running back and forth over and over. This has been going on for like an hour, and this is the second time that I've attempted to record this. The first time I had to stop because every time I touched the keyboard, she would attack. Don't know what was up with that, so we'll see if we can make it through this whole video. Alrighty, let me go ahead and screen share. Move this right here. Yeah, let's jump right into it. So what is Social Security? Social Security is a federal program that taxes workers to provide income support for the elderly. It's paid according to their lifetime earnings and is not based on current financial need like other social welfare programs. Let's break that down piece by piece. So Social Security was originally created in order to be a financial assistance for people back in the Great Depression time because some workers were getting to the age where they could no longer feasibly work. And it was difficult for them to continue on, and because like maybe they wouldn't have the physical capacities or the ability to still proceed in that job. But you don't want starving elderly people on the streets, right? That's also not good. So this program was a federal program that taxed everyone over their lifetime earnings and created an annuity that pays out once you hit a certain age and you decide to collect Social Security. It pays out a set amount each year. Based upon what your lifetime earnings were. You can get Social Security whether you have $5 billion or $500, right? It's not really based on your financial need. It's based upon what you had in your lifetime. So you have some proportion of this as future income, right? So you're taxed on it when you're younger and you're working, and then when you become elderly and you're no longer able to work, you receive some of this money back at kind of a prorated amount based upon what you have made in the workforce. So Social Security is actually fascinating, and you're probably very familiar with this. When you look at your paycheck stub at the bottom, you notice that you have your federal income taxes taken out. You have your state income taxes taken out, and then you have something called FICA. This is the Federal Insurance Contribution Act. These are different sort of taxes on your earnings that are matched by your employer as well when it comes to things such as employment. Yes, cat, come here. Come here. Ugh. Can you sit up there? There we go. But Social Security is to have these payments in which to offset your future. So who's eligible to receive Social Security? Well, everybody is, right? The only criteria for it is that you had to have worked and paid into payroll taxes for 40 quarters. Please stop. For 40 quarters or about 10 years, right, over your lifetime. And you also have to be at least 62. So you can be 62 and earn a partial amount of Social Security, or you can wait a few more years and get the full contribution amount of your Social Security. So how are Social Security benefits actually calculated, right? Because you're going to get some amount, and the amount that you're going to get is going to be different from the next person in class, or what your aunt's going to get, or what your friend's going to get, right? That's because these are annuity payments. They're payments that last until your death. And these benefits, this cat. I hope you all can actually see this in the video of her going back and forth so you know how crazy I'm being driven today. I tried putting her outside the door for one of these videos and she just started screaming and I couldn't do anything. All right, so payment size depends on the recipient's average earnings over 35 highest earning years, right? So this doesn't really hurt you for the years where maybe you had to be a cashier, or maybe like, you were working through college and maybe you worked like 12 hours a week at Sonic or something. It doesn't hurt you for those years. It's your 35 highest earning years. So the years where you made the most amount of money, it's kind of averaging that together. And there's a proportion of this that you'll receive back as Social Security. Benefits are a redistribution function, right? So in the past, when you're young, you get taxed FICA. You put your payments into the Social Security program, right? And then when you're older and you're no longer able to work, you get some of that money back, right? Benefits, as the replacement rate falls, so the amount that it takes to like replace your income and things like that, it falls with the average index monthly earnings. So the more and more and more and more that you earn, you're going to make more money, but at a slightly slower pace, right, when you have your eventual retirement. So the ratio of benefits received to earnings prior to the entitling event, i.e. you retire. All right, so what does that necessarily mean? Okay, when you're working in your younger years, say that this is the average of your 35 highest earning years in your younger years. Well, those first few dollars that you make, you're going to see a lot of that money back in retirement. Through your Social Security. Now, the more and more you make, you're going to see less and less, right? If you're making $2,384 a month, well, then maybe you're only going to see a small proportion of that back in Social Security at your later time, and not nearly as much as you would as a proportion of your first few dollars earning. So that's just the idea that it kind of decreases over time. Past earnings are translated into increased benefits, but at slower rates. The person who made $15,000 a year is going to see a relatively large chunk of money compared to that $15,000 when they retire as their retirement benefit. Someone who makes $5 million a year is not going to see that same percentage of the $5 million as the person had as the $15,000, right? They're going to have a slightly smaller percentage of what that $5 million was, because the amount of benefit goes down the more money you make. Or, well, I guess the percentage increase goes down the more money you make. So how are these Social Security benefits paid out? Well, you can claim it at different times, right? So once you hit 62, you're able to claim Social Security. But this is during your early entitlement age. So the earliest age at which your Social Security recipient can receive your reduced benefits is going to be about 62. Now, this does change pretty often. So, and there's a lot of legislation looking at changing this. So I don't know if this is going to be current in a few years, but it's about 62. Now, that's going to be at a penalty because you're collecting it early. Now you can continue to maybe hold off on collecting your payments. So decide maybe at 62, you're like, you know what, I can work another year or two. You can work 63 and 64 and 65. And then maybe once you hit 67 or 68, then you can claim retirement, or you decide to claim retirement. And at this point, you're not going to have that penalty for claiming it in your older years, but you get it at your older years, right? This is your full benefits age. It's the age at which Social Security recipients receive the full amount of their retirement benefits, right? Okay, so delaying beyond this full benefit age, let's say that you decide that you don't want to retire till like 74, right? So maybe you just really, really, really love working. Actually, we see this with academics a lot. I've had some professors that have retired 3 or 4 times and they're in their 80s and still teaching because, you know, teaching keeps you young. But the thing is, that means that they're delaying their full benefits age for Social Security because they instead decide to work for a higher salary. So they can get an increased benefit of 8% each year that they decide to not claim their Social Security. This is called a delayed retirement credit. So this is a bunch of fancy language for saying that we're trying to make it as a society so that when you claim retirement, that time in between your retirement and your expected age of death, right? So your life expectancy, that difference is going to have an amount of money that's similar to what you paid into it. Now, if you live for longer, maybe you're going to need more money because it's an annuity. It pays out until you die. That means if you retire early, maybe at 62 as opposed to 67, well, then this is more time that you're having to be covered by Social Security. So they're going to lower the amount of payments that you have in each pay period because you have made a decision to retire early, which has increased the amount of time until your eventual life expectancy expiration. So can you work and receive Social Security? This is actually a very interesting question that in 40 to 50 years, you're going to be interested to know. So the answer is kind of, right? The earnings test reduced the benefits for 62 to 64-year-olds by 50 cents for each dollar of earnings they have above 17,000. Essentially, if you make a small amount of money, so roughly less than 17,000, you can continue to work for a small amount of money and still receive some Social Security benefit. Though the more and more you go over the 17,000, you're going to end up having a penalty to it. So you're going to receive less Social Security because you still have money from other sources. These benefits are later returned to you. So this little less amount that they pay you, it's later returned to you when your earnings fall below the threshold again. So what about family members, right? Let's say that maybe you're married to someone who is claiming Social Security, or maybe you're the child of someone who's collecting Social Security, and this person might pass away. Well, spouses of people who claim Social Security are children of deceased workers, and spouses who survived their Social Security recipients. So if your spouse had been claiming Social Security and died, then you'd be able to receive the benefits for this and be able to get a payout, because this was the expected household income that your household had expected to get, right? And same thing for children of deceased workers. If you are under the age of 18 and you have a parent that passes away, you can receive Social Security payments that were a portion of what they had earned before they passed away. And this is to be able to help with consumption smoothing for family members, so that there's not a giant shock where they lose all of their household income. It's a way to still keep them financially viable until they can adjust, right? So what's the big picture of how Social Security works? So there, you can really have two different types of annuities. This is an annuity, right? You can have funded. Funded refers to different types of retirement plans, right? And these retirement plans are ones where you take today's savings and you invest them in various assets. These are kind of the idea of your private retirement plans. If you decide to have an IRA, for example, and you can invest these into different mutual funds or stocks or bonds, which if you ever want to talk about that, let me know. But we have a fantastic finance group who can also just teach you this. Random fact, I was a finance major before I was an economist. So you invest them into that in order to pay your future benefits. So I set aside some money, they all go into mutual funds, and when I retire, I get that money back. Then there's the idea of unfunded. So unfunded refers to retirement plans in which payments collected from today's workers go directly to today's retirees instead of being invested. That's the idea of the FICA money that comes out of my paycheck doesn't go into any sort of investment. Instead, it gets paid directly to a current retiree. Social Security is the weird part in between the two, right? So our taxes today do end up funding some of our future benefits, but not necessarily all. Some of it does actually get redistributed from younger workers to older workers who are retired, which is kind of a redistribution of income in between the two. And then some of it goes into being invested in assets to be able to fund your retirement later. This has been a precarious balance for a really long time that's accentuated by the fact that we have the baby boomer generation that's retiring, right? So the baby boomer generation, they're retiring in droves, which means that the number of retirees that are supported by the average still working person, I think it's like 2.7 or something like that. It's a ridiculous number of people that are supported by each current worker. And this is only going to get more pronounced over time. So it's something that we're going to have to think about as we have one of the lowest birth rates, and the baby boomers are the baby boomer group is retiring in droves, right? Then you're going to have a larger proportion of retirees compared to the number of people who are paying into the system. These are one of the huge issues that we need to figure out as public economists, is how are we going to actually correct Social Security or make it viable for another 30, 40 years? Because right now it's not planned to be. Right? A lot of people believe it's going to go bankrupt as early as 2035, while others believe closer to 2050 or 2070. And until we come up with some sort of financial change, that's where the projections are. So there might have to be some differences that are made during that time if we're going to expect Social Security by the time that, for example, I myself retire, or maybe you retire. I don't know. I don't know any of your ages, so I'm not going to make assumptions on when you're going to retire. Whew. All right, let's go into the next idea. Oh, this one's a cool story. So I actually want to tell you about the beginning of Social Security, right? So Social Security started in the 1930s. And the very first, well, though it started in the 1930s, people still had to pay into it, right? So they paid into it for a little bit, and then they could get their Social Security payments in the 1940s onwards. So the very first beneficiary of Social Security, and I just think this is a really cool story, her name was Ida Mae Fuller. So she worked for only 3 years after they established Social Security. Social Security came in, she worked for about 3 years. At that time, you didn't have to have 40 quarters of work, so you didn't have to have the full 10 years, because they were trying to help the elderly individuals right then that were still being harmed from a lot of the overlay that had happened from the Great Depression, right? Because the people who were working during the Great Depression were not able to really save for retirement in a way that we had hoped or expected. So the government had to step in with a different plan to be able to help these people who had worked during the Great Depression and did not necessarily save. So she worked for 3 years after the establishment of the Social Security system, and she paid $24.75 in Social Security taxes in her time working. So she was issued the first ever Social Security check on January 31st, 1940 for $22.40, which was almost exactly what she had paid in Social Security taxes. She ended up living 35 more years. And here's the important part to think about. The average life expectancy back at this time was about 64, 65. So you weren't really expected to live any longer than when you retired. When you retired, everything that you lived after that was kind of a bonus above the life expectancy. And they gave you this annuity payment through that time that you lived above the life expectancy. Today, it's completely different, right? Our life expectancy is growing. I think it's like 78 for men and like 80 for women in the United States, depending on what neighborhood you're in, and a lot of other socioeconomic factors, it turns out. But those are really, really good statistics. But the thing is, that means that we're no longer targeting retirement to what your life expectancy is, which means that we're paying out for longer periods of time, which is a lot of the issue that we see with Social Security, because we're giving payments for longer than we expected. Now, Ida, she retired at 65. And ended up dying at the age of 100. So she lived an additional 35 years making her Social Security paychecks, right? Or got her Social Security checks. So even though she was the first ever person to get Social Security, and she only paid almost $25 into the system, she received $22,888.92 in benefits in her 35 years of life after that. I just think that that's kind of interesting, you know? So what are some lessons that we've learned from this? Unfunded Social Security systems end up redistributing essentially taxes paid by young people to elderly individuals who are past the age that is considered acceptable for retirement, and it's putting this system forward. Now, the thing is, whenever you come up with some sort of wealth transfer program or a redistribution program, the people that will have the largest benefits to it are the first generations, right? Ida Miller was the first one who ended up having the Social Security payments, which means that she paid in very little and received a lot. But the thing is, over time, this has kind of changed. We might pay a lot more now than what we're going to see in the time that we retire if things have not changed by that point. So unfunded systems can create legacy debt. For example, if someone lives 35 years longer than we expected, then that's something that we have to calculate into the system. That's debt that's going to be put onto the next generation later on. This legacy debt is debt that's incurred by the government because early generations of beneficiaries receive so much more than they actually put in taxes, and therefore it becomes a compounding problem over time of when we eventually have debt that we don't always know how to pay off within the systems because we're constantly making payments and not necessarily putting away the money that would be expected to save for the next generation, right? So why do we even have Social Security to begin with? Well, it serves as a form of consumption smoothing, right? I know I've mentioned consumption smoothing before. Consumption smoothing is the idea that, for example, I might not make as many cups of tea today because I'd like to have some cups of tea tomorrow, right? I'm consumption smoothing. I might save a little bit of money now because I know in 2 weeks when the rent's due that I'm going to have less money that week. So I'm going to like save a little now so that I have a fairly equal amount of money in between that I spend in this period versus what I spend in that period that I also pay for rent. Right? It's consumption smoothing is just the idea that maybe you save money or borrow money so that you kind of have a similar amount of income over time. Actually, here's a really good example of why you might know it. Well, it's not like you can talk back here, but have any of you taken out like a student loan above what you needed for your tuition? So there's a lot of people who will end up doing this. Their tuition might be about $5,000, but they'll get a loan for like 10 or 15,000. And for that 10 or 15,000, they use that to pay their rent, or they use it to pay for a car payment, or to be able to, pay for groceries and stuff while in college. But you have to pay that back later, right? So it's borrowing from your future self to help out your present self to give you a similar amount of money. You're taking away money from future self to give more to present self so that your consumption's fairly similar. This is called consumption smoothing. It's a fascinating concept in economics. So market failures exist. right? This is any time where our social marginal benefit and social marginal costs do not align with what our private marginal benefit and private marginal costs are. Market failures in annuity markets and these long-term payments, well, the most simple one that we see is the longer a person lives, the less money the insurer makes from it, right? If we have an annuity contract where we tell someone, yeah, if you make us this amount of payment, we will pay you X amount every month until you die. Well, if you never die, or you die many, many years later, right? Each additional year that you live, that's less money that insurers make off of it, which makes annuity contracts very difficult. This leads to very high prices for annuities. So most people don't really want to buy them. You can technically get a private annuity, right? You have to pay your Social Security because, you know, the government says so, unless you're a state employee. I actually pay into the SERS system, into the Social Security system. Besides that, that's overly complicating things. There are private annuity contracts, right? You can pay X amount of money every day of your youthful life so that when you retire, you will get a set paycheck. The thing is, insurers have no idea how long you're going to live. And there's a good chance you might live longer than they really expect you to, or you might live longer than the life expectancy. So because this is not necessarily the best bet for them, they're going to make those annuity contracts very, very expensive. Well, if they're very, very expensive, then the person managing a McDonald's may not buy one, right? Actually, managers at McDonald's make pretty good salaries, but you know, the grocery clerk may not buy one, or someone who may not necessarily be at the top of their potential wealth spectrum is going to purchase that annuity, right? It's going to be something that you're going to see more for rich people. So there's this idea of almost paternalism for Social Security, because there's these market failures where you can't give these annuity markets privately. Maybe government should instead step in, because we expect that people won't save enough. They know that annuity contracts are expensive, so they're not going to get them. But also, they're just not going to save enough money. I bet you're not taking money out of each of your paychecks right now to save for retirement. Instead, you're going to get about 10 years away from retirement and be like, oh no, what am I going to do for money? Policymakers worry that this is the situation that will happen, that we will have a lot of elderly individuals that did not save enough, and then therefore they will be extremely impoverished in their elder years. So we know that this is the case. Outside of Social Security, most workers in the United States actually have very little savings outside of their Social Security system. So we have this in place to at least have some sort of safety net. It's not going to be the same as the amount of money that you had. It's honestly not even a whole bunch, but it's enough to be able to pay the bills and to have some sort of subsistence after the time of retirement. What we have seen is one really interesting thing that we've seen from Social Security is that as Social Security has gone up and we started to spend more money on it and it's become a larger percentage of GDP, the elderly poverty rate has gone down. So back in the 1940s and early 1950s, it was almost 1/3 to 1/2 of elderly individuals were completely impoverished. They were 100% dependent off of living on their family or on government assistance because they could not afford their bills and they would go to government assisted living facilities. Now what we've seen is since the Social Security has come in, there's people have more freedom, they have more ability to take care of themselves in their elder years. So the elderly extreme poverty rate has declined. So that's kind of interesting. All right, so now we've covered Social Security. Let's go to the next one. Let's talk about income distributions within the United States. This one's always a little depressing. Let's get right into it. So let's start this up with an example. The last week of April 2015, there were several weeks of violence in Baltimore, Maryland. So I'm going to talk about a situation from a few years ago. Because it's one that we have data resulting from, so we can see a lot of the information. But please remember that these are similar things that are happening now, and it's what part of the conversation we're having now as a society is too, because these problems never stopped, right? There was still lots of different tensions, and there's a lot of damages and a lot of socioeconomic harm that's not being addressed, and it's something that we need to think about, right? If we're going to have a functioning society. So in the last week of April 2015, there was lots of violence in Baltimore, Maryland. This is because there was Freddie Gray. He was a minority prisoner, and while in the custody of police, he ended up dying. Right? So he ended up having a death in police custody. There were massive protests throughout Baltimore. 113 police officers were injured, 486 people were arrested, $9 million of damage happened to businesses. And while there might have been violence associated with this, the larger cause of a lot of these tensions weren't necessarily just one death, right? It was response to a systematic inequality that was happening in the city of Baltimore that finally boiled over, that people had been upset about for a really long time, because neighborhoods that were only a few miles apart had different life circumstances. Let me show you what I'm talking about, right? This is a lot of the reason why people were so upset, because check it out. Here's the neighborhood of Roland Park. Roland Park has an average life expectancy of 84. If you live in this neighborhood, you're expected to live to about 84. You also have on average about $250,000 a year. You have extremely good access to grocery stores. You have extremely good access to doctors and gyms and resources and daycares. And then just 3.5 miles away or so, we have Sandtown, Winchester, and this was where Freddie Gray was from, right? This is a handful of miles, and the average life expectancy in this neighborhood was 67, right? 67, that's much lower than 84, by the way. And access to grocery stores was almost did not exist. Instead, there were just corner stores that were more like gas stations that happened to have some sort of groceries to it. There's huge income discrepancies here. There's not available parks or resources or funding for that, and because there's no real property value, there's no decent school systems. So there's just this systematic poverty that's happening over time. And look at these massive differences in between these two places. This is something that had developed over the past 100, 200 years that have made it so that these two individual neighborhoods, just a few miles apart, can determine if you're going to live almost 20 years longer or not. So this was a systematic issue that happened in between different sort of socioeconomic statuses, which also manifested itself in a lot of racial tensions. Because, I mean, we're economists, right? We can look at the numbers. The numbers are uneven. And that's something that we have to think about because we're public economists, right? We care about the expenditures and the taxation of government. So we have to look at these two places and realize that tax revenues are way higher in one than the other. And all the resources are going to one of these neighborhoods and not necessarily the other, which perpetuates the next one, right? So we have one time period where one group's doing well and one group's not doing well. And then we have the next time period, and the one group that's doing well now has built up wealth and can continue to grow on that wealth, while the one that did not have wealth and was barely struggling to get by, if no resources are allocated to them, they will continue to be harmed, right? Because they're at different starting points in that time period. And this is something to think about when we're trying to address systematic socioeconomic differences and systemic racial issues, right? So there's just massive differences in life expectancy in these two areas. In Freddie Gray's neighborhood, the average life expectancy was 67, while right up the road it was 84. The life expectancy in Freddie Gray's neighborhood is well below what it is in North Korea. Right? In North Korea, one of the poorest countries in the world that has had about the same GDP level for decades and has massive starvation in the country, has a better life expectancy of about 68 than this one neighborhood in Baltimore. And this isn't an isolated example. I'm not talking about just one example. 15 neighborhoods in Baltimore have a life expectancy lower than North Korea. And this enormous discrepancy represents a huge underlying difference in the economic resources that are allocated to these neighborhoods. Well, we're public economists. We have to study what is being done with expenditures and resource allocation and what can be done with expenditures and resource allocations. It's our jobs to put on our econ thinking hats and think about what could truly, what options are, or how we can deal with discrepancies. So, The resource discrepancies that I'm talking about highlight a central question that kind of underline public economics. And it's a difficult question, right? Because none of this is easy to figure out. Social welfare may be maximized by redistributing income from high-income individuals to low-income individuals, but the private sector left alone is very unlikely to do this, right? So it's not necessarily that everybody's going to say, oh, well, we see that the life expectancy is so much lower in the neighborhood next to us, so we're going to give a proportional amount of our income willy-nilly for fun to put a park there and to give resources there and to build a grocery store, because that's just unlikely to happen. We've looked at data from hundreds of cities over time, and it just, though it happens in some small amounts, it's not to the extent that people need, right? Government can solve this problem by taxing citizens and providing public redistribution, but people hate that. Right? That's very, very unpopular to tell people like, hey, we are going to raise your taxes. It's an extremely unpopular policy provision. So, for example, the most well-known source of redistributing income to low-income citizens is through just cash welfare transfers, right? Where there's different sort of government programs that might make cash payments to low-income populations to try to help them build and at least get the resource allocations to be able to continue their growth path, right? So let's think about some US data, because we're in the US and we're studying national public economics. So relative income inequality has increased in the United States, right? That's not new information. We knew that. Relative income inequality just means that the amount of income that the poor have relative to the rich. So notice this is income, right? This is not wealth. This is the amount of money that people are making on a yearly basis. This is not including all the stocks that people have sitting aside. This is not including the houses that people own. This is not including different sort of grants or trusts or things like that, right? This is purely just the income people get from their job. And we saw in 1967 that about 4% of the income that people make from their job on a yearly basis was made by people in the lowest 20% of the income distribution. So the poorest 20% of people made about 4% of the income in each given year. The highest 20%, so the 20% of people that had the highest incomes, their portion of the total amount of income money was about 43.8%, right? So that means the top 20% richest people made about 10 times as much as the bottom 20% most impoverished people back in 1967. Now let's go forward to one of the years that we have good data for, which is 2016. The study's done about every 5 years, but the 2020 data is going to have issues. So let's talk about 2016. In 2016, the lowest 20% of the population had about 3% of the total income. So the total amount of money that everybody made in a year, about 3% of it were made by the bottom 20%. And about 51.5% was made by the top 20%. Now, those don't seem like massive differences, but going from 4% to 3.1%, that's a reduction in the percentage of income in the lowest 20th percentile by almost a fourth, about a fourth. That's a large change, right? So we're seeing that these numbers are getting further apart over time. And that's not even speaking about wealth, right? This is just money people make on a yearly basis. But if we start talking about stocks, which are much more likely to be owned by rich households than poor households, housing, mutual funds, businesses, boats, trusts, these are all things that are endowments, much more likely to be owned by people in the highest 20% relative to people in the lowest 20% of the income distribution, right? So the share of the total income in the top 1% of people kind of declined for a bit during, the Great Depression. Things were bad. But then eventually started to spike back up, especially around the 90s, 80s. And today we're seeing that there's a higher and higher percentage of this income that's at the top 1%. Now, let's think about this relative income inequality in other countries, right? So we saw that in 2016, we had 3.1 and 51.5. Yeah, 51.5 and 3.1. Let's look at some other countries. So if we're talking about their bottom 20%, this is the bottom 10% right here. Let's look at their bottom 20%. We see that many other countries, this is Austria, Belgium, Canada, Czech Republic, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, they tend to stay around 8% of the income is made by the bottom 20%, while about 35 to 40% of the income is made by the top 20% of people in that income distribution. So this one, let's do it again. Hungary, Italy, Korea, Luxembourg, Mexico, New Zealand, Norway, very similar story that we see here, where in between 5 and 10% in the bottom 20%, and in between about 35 and 40 in the top 20%, except for Mexico. Mexico's actually much more income divergent than I had expected. Then we have Poland, Portugal, Slav Republic, Sweden, Turkey, UK, US, and just kind of the OECD average, right? Let's look at this bottom one, the US versus the OECD average. So this is, and these numbers are slightly different because this is the OECD record, while the other one was the census record, and the numbers tend to be a little off sometimes. But what we're seeing is that in the United States, the bottom 20% of individuals do have less of the income as a percentage of total income than what is average in other OECD countries. We also see that the top 20% tends to have more income than what is essentially typical in other OECD countries outside of like Turkey and Mexico. So let's talk about poverty rates, right? Because we have two possible situations, right? It could be that there's this really, really high income inequality where a lot of people are in poverty and some people are not. Or it could be that that society is doing really, really, really well and has had a lot of growth. And though there's this huge income discrepancy, everybody's above the poverty line. Well, then how do we figure out the poverty line? Let's figure that out. So debating on how to measure poverty rates is something that economists have thought about a lot, especially public economists, because it's our job. So first we have the idea of absolute deprivation, right? It's the amount of income that poor have relative to some sort of measure of minimally acceptable income. So you're deprived if you are unable to meet this minimally acceptable income. Now, inequality doesn't necessarily measure this absolute deprivation, right? If I'm telling you that we have lots of inequality, well, we don't know if people are under this minimal acceptable income. It could be that we have a lot of inequality, but everybody's above the minimally acceptable income. Or it could be that we have a lot of inequality, but everybody's below the minimally acceptable income, and they're all very, very poor, and there's just a lot of inequality among the poor. So we need to figure out what the poverty rates are to figure out where that line is and what proportion of people are above a minimally acceptable income level. Well, first, we need to figure out what our minimally acceptable income level is. In the United States, we call this the poverty line. You probably see it because a lot of different things are tagged to it. So if, for example, a lot of government assistance programs require that you have to be under 175% of the federal poverty line to get assistance. That's a pretty standard number, but it's very different by states. So the federal government standard for measuring this absolute deprivation, we haven't changed the definition at all since the 1960s, which is terrible, by the way. We'll talk about this. But it's determined to be 3 times the cost of a minimally nutritious accepted diet. So the amount of money that it costs for you to get enough calories to live, that price tag times 3, that's what the poverty line is. If you've ever wondered how the government decides the poverty line and you hear like, oh, you need this much to be in the poverty line, that's it. It's figuring out how much it would cost to feed you or your family a basic nutritious diet and multiplying it by 3. So what does that mean? So in 2018, that meant if you were one person, it would cost you about $4,000 to feed yourself the basic amount of calories that you needed to get through the year. So your poverty line is 3 times that, which is about $12,000. We have not changed this definition since the 1960s. It's the exact same today. For 2 people, it's the idea that, okay, well, maybe it doesn't actually take you as much then, so we're going to only give you 16,000, 20, 25, 29, 33, 38. If you get to a household of 8, you can make up to 42,000 and still be under the poverty line because that's 3 times what it thinks that it will cost you to actually feed a family of 8. And then for each additional person, you can add on an additional 4,000. That's not a lot of money, right? Like that's That's like that's about $1,000 a month. I think the average rent price in Edwardsville is like $1,050 or something. So this is about what the average rent price is, and that's not including food or electricity or internet or anything else like that. So that's shocking, right? But what have we seen over time? Well, what we've seen over time is that the percentage of the population under the poverty rate has fallen. So we have seen that, especially for like people age 65 and over. Well, we started including Social Security, and now that they have payments based upon what their incomes were before they retired, they get some sort of payment related to that. So we've seen that poverty for this blue line right here, the 65 and over crowd, this has gone down. For the other ones, what we've seen is it's kind of been weird, right? So for people under 18, children, we've seen that their poverty rate initially declined until the 60s, and then it goes up and down and up and down. We've seen very similar where we had similar initial drops for all people, this red line, or people 18 to 64, so the adults who are not retirement age, we saw a decrease. But then we've seen that it's been fairly stagnant with slight up and downs all the way till our current period, right? So there's some problems with that poverty line measure. 3 times the minimally accepted nutritious diet doesn't factor the fact that we have very different needs in 2020 and 2021 and onwards than we did in 1965. So, or excuse me, 1964 when they first came up with things. Now, today, they're saying that the very basic amount of money that you need is the minimum amount of calories, the cost of that times 3. But that doesn't include the fact that, like, we need internet, right? We are now in a society where it is almost impossible to function without internet. You can't take classes. Like, you literally can't take classes without internet. You cannot search for jobs. You cannot interview for jobs. You have to have internet, right? And that's not included in the bundle. The bundle is only the minimum amount of calories for you to survive. It doesn't include any sort of healthcare cost, because now preventative healthcare has become a much more important part of our lives, because just the basis of having like flu shots available in one neighborhood versus another can explain about half a year of life expectancy in between the two. So the bundles have changed. What we actually need to consider, like the basic surviving, is just different than it was in 1960. We also now have differences in cost of living, right? Having one poverty line does not make sense when we have drastically different cost of livings. In Los Angeles, I think it's like, to be able to afford, or I think the average rent there is something like $3,000. To be able to live there, to reasonably live there in cost of living, you need to make at least $50,000 or $60,000 a year and have roommates, lots of roommates. While if you go to the lower regions of Mississippi, you may not need as much, right? Food costs are cheaper, rent's extremely cheap, but there may not be as many jobs there as you would find in like Los Angeles. The idea of poverty in rural Mississippi versus urban California are two completely different situations, and they have two completely different costs associated with them. It might be much cheaper financially to be poor in Mississippi than it is to be poor in Los Angeles. And our income definition is also really incomplete, right? Notice that we had said, 3 times the amount of nutritionally acceptable calorie costs. But this doesn't include the fact that like some people get Medicaid, so it's not adjusting for the income that are the differences in what you're really getting based upon Medicaid. It's not dealing with what you might be getting from other different sorts of programs, such as the WIC program or the SNAP program. So essentially, what you've just learned is that the poverty line in the United States was determined back in 1964, and the entire measure is garbage and should be updated because there's lots of problems with it. Oops, we went backwards. So why does it matter how much the rich have? Because we were talking earlier about like the differences in income in between the poor and the rich. Well, the minimum standard of living can kind of be defined as the relative standard of living to others sometimes, right? So we have the idea of the poverty line, like what's the basic subsistence to live. But then another one that people think is really interesting is what the standard of living is in between different categories. Can a rich person, can they buy 20 times as many things as I can? Do they make 1,500 times as much money as I do? What's our standard of living? And comparing that together. Greater relative inequality itself may decrease individual well-being. It turns out when you have income concentrations that are at a much higher level, where like the top 20% makes a majority of the 20% of money, it turns out that that means that the well-being for lots of other people are just not as high, right? They can't afford to go to as many movies and concerts, or out to eat as often, or to have a car every few years, right? This income inequality itself might manifest in just drastic differences in what life experiences are. There's a reason why Freddie Gray's neighborhood was very different from these other neighborhoods. And a lot of this comes to the fact that this income inequality had really reduced even the fundamental well-being of these poor neighborhoods in Baltimore. And that was a problem. That was a systematic problem, right? So welfare programs can come in one of two ways, because we're public economists, we talk about welfare programs. They can come as categorical welfare or means-tested welfare. You've probably heard both of these before, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about what they are. Categorical can't speak today. Categorical welfare is a welfare program that's restricted by some sort of demographic characteristic. If you're a single mother, you can get the WIC program for your infant. If you have a disability and you are absolutely unable to functionally work a job, there's categorical welfare programs to help you, right? These are ones that are based upon some sort of feature that's not income. The next types are means-tested welfare programs. These are ones that anyone can join, but they're restricted by income and asset levels. So the Pell Grant, that one's based upon your income and your asset levels. Let's see, what's some other good ones? The SNAP program, right? So you don't necessarily get SNAP because you're a single mother or not a single mother. You get SNAP because you're below an income level and you have less than so many assets. So this is kind of the means tested program. So categorical is because of a category, means tested is because of income, but most programs kind of include both, at least somehow. So let's think about what welfare policies actually are, right? So there's a lot of different welfare programs that the national government partakes in, and that's because the social marginal benefit of helping some people and allowing them to better themselves and be able to work and be able to get wages and to be able to improve their lives and not suffer is actually way better for society than not in many cases. So we have a government to create welfare programs during these situations. Now, welfare programs can come in two different types, right? We have cash welfare programs. So these are welfare programs that provide cash benefits to someone. Economists actually really like this, and I'll tell you why. And this is like kind of a fundamental reason of public choice, which we had covered earlier. Because if we give people things, we're forcing them to do certain stuff, right? If we give them 3 loaves of bread and 2 fish and 3 boxes of tea, then they have bread, fish, and tea. If we instead give them $20, it allows them to buy like as many bread and fish and teas and maybe medicine that they need. And because the person who knows what a person needs best is that person, right? And they can kind of make their decisions in between themselves to go to whatever gives them the highest marginal benefit. So that's why cash welfare programs are actually really popular against public choice economists, because they provide cash benefits to recipients. Now, there's benefit guarantees. This is the cash welfare benefit for individuals with no other income, which may reduce as income increases. That means, okay, I'll give you $1,500 and you can work, But if you work, if you go above that $0, for each $1,000 you make at work, I'm going to take away $100 and pay you $100 less. So if you make $1,000, I'm going to pay you $1,400. If you make $2,000, I'm going to pay you $1,300, right? The benefit goes down as your income goes up. Those are benefit guarantees. They guarantee that you'll at least be at a certain level. The next one is benefit reduction rates. The rate at which that decreases, that's going to be the benefit reduction rate. So if it's $100 for each 1,000 you make, or if it's 30% of your benefits for each additional 15% in income that you make. These rates are the rates at which welfare benefits are reduced per dollar of income earned. Okay, so those are cash welfares. The more money you make, the less cash welfare programs you get. Then there's in-kind welfare. In-kind welfare is not cash-based, so we don't hand people money. In-kind welfare hands people goods, right? This is the idea of like having medical care, or we give a housing voucher, or we deliver meals to someone's house, right? It's giving an item. So cash welfare is money, in-kind welfare is goods and services. So let's talk about cash welfare programs, because there's a lot that the federal government's involved with, right? So let's start with temporary assistance for needy families. This is called TANF. This was, I think, what was actually originally the SNAP program. Or no, it's not. This one's technically a tax rebate, I think. There's a lot of these to remember. So the temporary assistance for needy families is if there's low income families where at least one parent is absent, there's a cash threshold, right? So if you have a single parent household, whether it be a mother or a father or a non-binary parent, they can get some amount of benefits. And these cash welfare benefits for individuals who have no other income will be at some level. And then as they make more and more money, these benefits are going to reduce because they're making more of their own money. So they need less of this money, right? And there's a reduction rate of how fast your income has to go up by how much your benefits come down. The problem with these particular types of programs are that a lot of times it might end up locking people into poverty, right? Because if you think, wow, I'm making X amount of money, but the benefit reduction rate is really, really, really high. So if I make even a little bit of money, I'm not going to have any government benefit for daycare. I'm not going to have any government benefit to be able to help feed this family. And I won't be able to afford the child care that I need to be able to go work that job. So therefore, I just don't work, right? That's something that we run into all the time, is kind of this welfare lock because of these benefit reduction rates. Sometimes people get kind of trapped where they are because it's almost too expensive to leave the programs. Another really good one is the idea of like supplemental security income. So we have these for people who might be very old, people who might be blind, people who might be disabled and completely unable to work because of some sort of impairment to either physical or cognitive function. There's help and assistance for these people, right? These are cash welfare programs where we end up giving them a cash subsidy so that they can pay what is needed for them, whether that be doctor visits, whether that be housing, whether that be special equipment that you need to be able to have screen readers and things. These are supplemental security incomes. Let's think of a couple others. All right, this is the one that I was thinking of, SNAP. So SNAP was the ones that were originally called like, what were they? Wow, it's just been a long day. SNAP essentially is what you use to buy food, right? These are the idea of, okay, I am impoverished. I really need food to be able to feed my family. So what the government does is they put money onto my SNAP card each month, and then I can go and I can buy food. And it always has to be like non-prepared, non-hot food. So you can't spend it on like a rotisserie chicken, which I always thought was kind of weird. But you go to the cash register, you swipe the card, and then that comes off the credit amount that you have from the government that says, hey, here's some money for you to be able to have for groceries. Now, the reason why this is considered an in-kind program is because this money can only be used on food. right? So you can only use it in exchange for food. So it's kind of an in-kind program because we're only allowing people to get food with this. Then there's Medicaid, which is an in-kind program that only provides medical service. There's Section 8 vouchers, which provides housing, which is also an in-kind thing where we're giving somebody something. There's the WIC program for women's, infant, and children. So it's a supplemental nutritional program for low-income individuals that have very young infants or toddlers that like they need to give them the nutrition, right? Because the whole reason the WIC program exists is because we have a bunch of data that says, hey, if you give like a basic increase in nutritional value to these low-income infants, they're way healthier for the rest of their lives. And it not only saves them thousands of dollars, it saves the government millions of dollars in the long term. So we give nutritional assistance to people in these very early infant years because it helps, right? This isn't an in-kind transfer. School lunch programs and breakfast programs, these are in-kind transfers. Oh, so we have these cash welfare programs and we have in-kind programs. Let's talk about UBI. Because UBI has actually come up a lot lately. It's something that was talked about before the election, but it's something that's talked about in a majority of countries as they've kind of tried to figure out what are we doing, right? There's a couple cities right now that are experimenting with UBI. There's a couple countries that have done it on a very limited basis. Some have been somewhat successful, others have not been successful at all. But the conversation around universal basic income has been growing for years. Accompanying this growth inequality has been a sense that existing welfare systems are not equipped to address people, right? As we've grown as a society, as technology has changed, there's been this feeling that, hey, maybe the SNAP program isn't very efficient, or hey, maybe we actually don't have like the drug rehabilitation programs, and we don't have the assistance for people of domestic abuse, and we don't have the like system to really help people who are disabled, and maybe there's just a lot of lackings in our welfare programs. So as technology has changed and as time has gone on, people have become more and more unhappy with our current structure of welfare programs. So for this reason, there's been a resurgence in an idea that policy experts designed decades ago and have kind of used as a thought experiment. And this is the idea of establishing a universal basic income. What this is it's the idea of we give everybody a flat grant of money, no strings attached. We go to every single person and we no longer have the welfare system for them, right? So they no longer have the SNAP benefits and they no longer have the WIC benefits or any of these other things. But instead what we do is we go to these people and we say, okay, instead of $500 in groceries and $300 in medical and $200 in these other things, we're instead going to just give you $2,000 a month. So we're going to get rid of the welfare programs. We're going to give you $2,000 a month, and you can spend it where you think is best, right? The idea of universal basic income is that each individual person knows what their marginal benefits are more accurately. So they'll know if $200 in healthcare is appropriate or not, better than the government could. Or they might know if $300 is acceptable for groceries or not, more than the government would, because they have a better understanding of what their individual needs are. So if we just give them one lump sum cash transfer, then they're able to make their decisions on what they spend it on instead of limiting to in-kind transfers, right? This is kind of already done in Alaska, roughly. So this is one of the closest examples that we have in the United States, right? This is the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend. Essentially in 1982, and to this day, the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend was put in place. Essentially, this is oil companies have the right to drill in Alaska, but in exchange, they put money into this fund, and this fund gives a paycheck to every single person in Alaska. So every year you live in Alaska, you make a paycheck. It's not a lot. It's not a ton of money, but you get this from the Alaskan Permanent Fund kind of to offset the cost of their drilling on your land, right? This payment ensures that all Alaskans end up benefiting from these oil revenues. So what have we seen from it, right? This is a way of being able to help benefit people from these different like oil revenues. But in this experiment, we've noticed that this has actually gotten 15,000 to 25,000 Alaskans out of severe poverty. That's 15 to 25,000 people that don't live in the street each year. That's 15 to 25,000 people who are able to provide like food and assistance to their children, right? That weren't necessarily able to before. And resulting from this is the fact that Alaska is actually now the most equal state in terms of the income distribution. So you know that difference between the 3% and the 51.5%, that's not necessarily the case in Alaska. And comparing their unemployment rate, because this is the big thing that everybody said. Well, they said if we put in a UBI, people aren't going to want to work because if you're giving them $3,000 a month, they're absolutely not going to work. Well, it turns out that the employment rate's about the same. The same rate of people in Alaska are working as they did before this program happened. So that's just something to think about. But then you also have the idea that maybe though people know what's best for them better than other people, hello cat, might know what's best for them better than other people. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to spend it that way, right? They might spend it on just ridiculous things because maybe they're addicted to gambling and they spend all the money on gambling. Well, then you come to the same problem where they may not have money for food or they may not have money for other sorts of medical needs. So this is something that a lot of people have liked and a lot of people haven't liked. Economists in general tend to be very supportive of universal basic income because it allows people to make their own choices. But I don't tell you how to think in this class, right? I give you a bunch of information and data and statistics and tools to analyze and kind of like let you form your own opinion. I just bring this up because I think it's something interesting for you to think about. So a UBI that would bring every citizen out of poverty. If we replicated what happened in Alaska and we replicated it and did it throughout the entire United States, it would be extremely expensive, right? It would cost about $1.5 trillion. That's the same as Medicare and Medicaid combined. $1.5 trillion, which actually doesn't sound like that much right now because I mean, when COVID happened, the federal government put a $1.5 trillion infusion, or not the federal government, the Federal Reserve put a $1.5 trillion infusion of money into the money supply to be able to prop up the stock market from falling. And this is what happened. Stock market was falling, stock market was falling. $1.5 trillion infusion, whoop, falling. It lasted 6 minutes. The stock market survived for 6 minutes based off of $1.5 trillion when that could have just brought every person in the United States out of poverty for a year. It's kind of weird, right? So that would be expensive to do. To bring every single person out of poverty in the United States would be expensive. So for this reason, attention started to turn to different variations of this proposal or more constrained proposals. The idea of maybe giving people less than what it takes to get them out of poverty, but at least having it so that every child has a basic, adequate, provided life, right? Like, so at least every child has a basic amount of food and a basic amount of education that we can guarantee. And that's kind of where the conversation has been for the last 2 years or so at this point. So congratulations, you know a lot more about the income distribution and about welfare programs in the United States and about Social Security. So these are all really interesting and fascinating topics that as public economists, this is our job to think about. All righty, well, everybody have a great one. I'm going to see you soon. Have an awesome day.